Okay, so this next application we're going to get into is a Windows Forms application. So our first GUI application. This is what we're going to build. Just a very basic program with a label and a button. And when I click on the button, it'll tell me how many times it's been clicked. Now in this case, it'll do every odd numbered one because we'll add in the code to make it do the odd number one on purpose, right? This is on purpose here. But basically it's going to tell me how many times I've clicked on the click me button, right? Very basic. But before we do, if you just look at this window, it's very natural, right? So I was saying earlier, with Java-based programs, you may have noticed it was very clunky, very silly looking, whereas the .NET programs, well, they're taking full advantage of Windows and the look and feel of Windows to build us programs that are natural, that are actual professionally built programs. So it's kind of nice here that we're getting a proper looking program with a proper looking button, proper looking, X, minimize and maximize. All these things will be here. So we're going to get all the bells and whistles that come with a typical Windows program. Right? So what we're going to do is start off by saying File, New, and Project. And when this pops up, this time we're going to choose Windows Forms application, making sure that Visual C# is the language that we are choosing. But Windows Forms application is what we're going to use, and we're going to use that here on in this first half of the course. Right? So down here we'll give it a name. I'm going to call mine W1 to represent week 1, and then call it, I don't know, WinForms 1. And I'll give it a home, so by hitting the browse button. And that looks good enough. So I'll select the folder, create directory for the solution, no source control, and then I'll just hit OK. And it's thinking, and it auto-generates a lot of things for me. So we'll come back to this in a second, this preloaded form. But let's look at what's here on the side in the Solution Explorer. So we have here our project is called W1 WinForms 1. It's a C# language application. We have properties. If I expand properties, I have assemblyinfo.cs. So we talked about that last time, but it has all our preamble. Any sort of settings we have, we can put into there. But there's a couple more things here. There's resources.resx and there's settings.settings. And we'll talk about those in a future application and how we can have some default settings that we can save inside settings, some default resources we can save inside resources. So allowing us to create customized information, having ready to go instead of having to reload every time. Right? So we can have custom settings in there. References, this just tell me which frameworks are being brought in. Notice we're having now system.drawing, system.windows.forms. So some additional ones compared to the command line one are now here. App config is still here, so we still have configuration in XML as well. And now, before I go to form1.cs, let's look at program.cs. And again, the .cs file extension tells me that this is a C# program. CS, C#. Right? That's the way to think of it. So program. Now, program.cs is a little bit different from what we saw a moment ago. Where in this case, now we have some lines of code here. So application, the application object, and in particular application.run, and it's saying new form1. So form1 being this object here, form1.cs, which we'll get into in a moment, is basically saying launch this first form. Okay? So when I run this, I'm going to see this. Basically the Windows form that we saw on the screen a moment ago. That's it. Right? It has my minimize, my maximize, and my X button. And if I click on X, it goes away. Alright, so let's go into form1.cs. If I expand it, there's form1.designer.cs, and then there's form1, right? And within form1, I have my class and my objects and whatnot. But essentially, when I double click on form1.cs, this is what appears. All right? So we're going to start by trying to design our little home page or our little home window here. Okay. So I can take this, I can resize it to be something like that. And now I have stuff I want to put on here. The question is, where do I find that stuff? So over here on the side I have toolbox. Now if you don't have toolbox, or if you don't have a side window on your screen, even if it's like this, right? If you don't have something like that, you can still find it by going to View and looking for Toolbox. Actually, not toolbars, Toolbox. There it is. And I can click on that and I can bring it in. Okay? And of course, you can drag these windows anywhere you want to have it where you want. Okay? You can have it floating as well. For space reasons, I will mostly leave the toolbox hidden. In this case, I'll leave it open for a minute because it's, it fits nicely onto my screen here, but I may hide it most of the time. If I expand all Windows forms, it gives me a list of different items available at my disposal. A whole bunch of different widgets here. So there's a ton of things. There's like menu strip, data grid view, data set, there's event log, whole bunch of things. But I'm going to start by grabbing a button. So I can drag this button onto my form. Right, so I'm going to put the button, let's say, over here. I can resize the button. There's a lot of nice guide bars to help me to drag it and allocate it. So it's basically saying that's a nice place to put it because it gives me some gap above and on the side. Right? So that's my first button. Now don't double click on that button just yet. Be very careful of this. There's a reason for double clicking. We'll talk about that in a moment. But let's add a label. So I scroll down a bit. I have label. I drag a label over here. Right? And it just says label 1. And this says button 1. Okay? I'm done with the toolbox, so I'm going to hide this so I have more space on the screen here. But I can still get it back by just mousing over and clicking, and it'll bring it back. Okay? But it's there. Now, I said earlier that the properties window is going to be the most important window we're going to use. It's over here, and here's why. So every item I bring onto the screen has an ID or has a name. If I scroll up or make sure I'm at the top of my properties window for something, and if I have something highlighted, so I'm going to start with label. Make sure label is highlighted, and if I go to the name property, it says label 1. I'm going to change this to be LBL text. There's a reason why I'm changing the name. And you're going to find that every time you drag something onto the screen, so if I drag 3 labels, it's going to be named label 1, label 2, and label 3 accordingly. Right? Every item on your screen must have a name, because the way we access it is through that name. Okay, so that's why we're giving it a name. That's why I'm changing my name to be something that makes sense. So you don't want to keep it as, label 1, label 2, because that gets confusing. That's like saying int x, int y, and int z in your program and assuming that you're going to realize that, or you're going to know what those values mean during time, right? So you want to give your variables a proper name. And I'm starting with LBL, short for label, right, to tell me, what kind of item I'm dealing with here, right? So LBL text will be the name of this label. I want to change the text here. So if I scroll down in my properties, I'll look for text. Now, everything for me is in alphabetical order. You might have it grouped or categorized. Up here where my mouse is right now, there's an option to change my order to categorize. So I can have it in most common groups, or I can have it alphabetized. So I prefer alphabetized so I know where I'm looking. So if I go down to text, I can change the text of label 1 to click me. And that'll change the text up here. So I can't change the text directly in the form, and I have to be very careful about double clicking on anything on this form to try and edit. Don't do it. All right? Use the property windows to do all your editing. Okay? It's your best friend. All right? So So I can change the text here. All right, so label's not so bad, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Just being able to get a label to display, getting it to be able to show us some information here. I can resize it. I can change the font. I could hide it using the visible property here. It's a common one as well. All right, I can do a lot of things with it. Okay, but I'm gonna leave the label alone. The button's really where I want to focus my attention for this application today. So now if I want to turn my attention to the button, I single click on the button. So notice I said single click. And I can start off with changing the name from button 1. I'm going to call it BTN click. So I can give it an ID here. BTN click. All right? And then if I scroll down, I can change the text of button 1 to be click me. So I'm going to look for text. I'm going to change the text from button 1 to click me. And it changed the text for me as well. Right? So far so good. We've just been dealing with the look of things. Now, the question is, we want to add an event handler. Right? In Java, you're so accustomed to adding event handlers, and you went through all this wonderful code to be able to bring in an interface, to add that action listener, to be able to do a click, to just display a number or something, right? And it took you a whole good half hour to do, right? And you felt great about it at the end of it, right? Well, I'm sorry to say it'll only take you half a second. Just double click on the button, and you have your event handler. So I am so sorry to take away that extra half hour from you and reduce that time. So here's our event handler. It's already auto-generated just by double-clicking. That's why I said be very careful about double-clicking. It's great, but it can get you into trouble. And there's a reason why I had you name it first before double-clicking on it. Because you could double-click on it first, but the problem is it's going to take your name or your ID of that variable and append it at the beginning, right? So notice my event handler is called btn click _ click, right? Be very careful of that. If you try changing the name of the button now, you may run into problems. So that's why we set our name first for the variable. Then we double click. All right, so let's get into taking this event handler and doing something with it, right? So that's the whole purpose of having event handlers. Let's actually create a variable here. And before we do that, let's actually look at the code that's here and see what's in front of us. So we have all of our using. So we have all of our usings here. We're bringing in a whole bunch of frameworks. All right, we'll talk about those frameworks over time. We have namespace. I said I'd get into namespace later on. But we have public partial class form1 and a colon. That colon is basically saying extends. So public partial class form1 extends form. We'll talk about partial classes later on. But essentially you have a class. It's called form1. It's a child class of form. That's really what it is. We have public form1. As you can guess, that's a constructor. All right. Initialize components, just a special method that launches to help configure your window. All right. And then here's our event handler, private void btn click. We have a couple of arguments here, object sender, event args e. These are just standard event handler arguments that go in. Okay. So let's create a class variable. I'm going to make it static on purpose because I want to remember the value. So I'm going to say static int and call it click count. Set it equal to 0 just to start off. All right, it probably should say private. You can say private static if you want. First line I'm going to do here is click count ++. Right, just to increment the counter. Meaning every time I enter this event handler, it's going to increment the counter for me. Right? Now, what I want to do is I want to update the label. So that label that was next to the button, I want it to tell me that it's been clicked and it's been clicked this many times. So all I have to do now is remember what the name of that variable was. So we called it LBL text, right? So we're just going to say LBL text. dot text is equal to, and then just set our text. So I'm going to say I've been clicked. But do a plus just like we did in in Java. So plus click count. We will add a little bit more here. Let's another plus times. Right, it gets cut off there. There. And now you can run it. You can try it out and see what happens. But you notice that I'm using lbltext.text. So lbltext is the name of the label that we called it. Dot text is that attribute. So the dot text, or the text attribute that we had in the properties, same name, right? So whatever names you see there, it's the same name, right? So lbltext.text. Set it equal, run your program, see what happens. Yep. So you click me. I've been clicked 1 time, 2 times, 3. Right? Click as many times as you want. Right? Last thing we'll do is just, control. We'll do a little bit more control. Right? Let's say every other click will display something. So let's say we do like an if statement here. We'll say like if click count mod 2 is 0. So maybe every other click. We'll just reset the text. So lbltext.text is equal to, just go back to click me. And we run it again. All right. So now we click. So now every odd numbered click number will be displayed. And so with this exercise, the purpose of this exercise was just to get you comfortable with Windows Forms, learn how to deal with buttons and labels, how to create an event handler, how to modify your code in the event handler, how to name your variables, right? So just getting started. But these are the main things you're going to take and move along in the world of .NET. You're going to do all these same things, not only in the Windows Forms side of things, but also in the web side of things. When you get to ASP.NET, you'll be doing the exact same stuff. Naming your variables, double-clicking on a button for an event handler, right? All those things. And there's other types of event handlers that we'll get into as well in a future application.